Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who pays more attention to college football messaging boards than most other things, and
someone who went to law school in New York. So the name John Jay rings a bell, but that's probably only because I saw him in various places and not because I could actually remember him as someone who was famous for things like being on the first Supreme Court. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
But then please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional and facts could change at any time. Do your own research.
So today you're listening to part 2 of the Supreme Court's history and origin story. If you haven't listened to part 1, we suggest you pause and start there.
Oh, if you want to listen to this episode first and not listen to part 1 first, as Tabitha Brown says, that's your business. All right. So in the last episode, we talked about how the Constitution established the Supreme Court. We talked about the dudes that were on the first Supreme Court. And we talked a little bit about the justices' initial responsibilities. We ended the episode talking about how the court went from 6 justices to 9, which is the number that's on the court today. Martin, are you feeling ready to dive back into some more Supreme Court fun?
Oof. I guess. I don't know. We covered so much in the last episode, and there's still so much more to be said about all of that. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested to get into some more of the juicy details.
So the Supreme Court is often defined by its Chief Justice. And if you visit the Supreme Court Historical Society's website, you will see a very helpful breakdown of the court eras based on the Chief Justice. So for example, 1789 through 1795 is called the Jay Court, since John Jay was the Chief Justice at that time. So, Martin, we talked about the 6 people. You looked at their pictures. You had your thoughts about their respective abilities, but John Jay was the one deemed the Chief Justice. Martin, had you heard about this resource at the Supreme Court Historical Society that kind of breaks out the court eras? Are you familiar with that? Is that something that lay people are aware of?
No, I don't think so. I haven't ever seen it myself either. I don't think many people are probably that aware of it. I'm not sure how many people are actually really interested in it because I think for much of the history of our court, while it has a ton of power, I don't think people have been quite aware of the impact and the role that they serve. So, but I was not aware of this. I haven't seen it before.
And that's what our podcast is for, to share resources exactly like this. So, because this is a short podcast, we will not get into every court and Chief Justice. We'll quickly talk about 2 courts to illustrate how different they can be. And Martin, I want to start with the Warren Court, in part because it's come up on the podcast before, and in part because many of the decisions from that court led to some kind of dope precedent that we have, that we at least hope we will still have for the foreseeable future. Martin, any thoughts before we dive into the Warren Court?
No, I think, yeah, I don't think I have any thoughts. I'm curious. I think you could spend a lot of time learning about the different history of the courts, and I think
Yes.
law in particular is definitely something that is heavily reliant on history. But yeah, no, let's get into it.
Excellent. And I agree, by the way. Do you know anything about Chief Justice Earl Warren?
Off the top of my head, no. His name sounds kind of familiar, and I feel like if you're a Supreme Court justice and your name is known, it's either for very bad or very good reasons, which I think is also just that doesn't seem appropriate for a judge, right? Like, you shouldn't know who judges are, right? They should be uncontroversial and they should be relatively neutral arbiters of the law. So the fact that I kind of know his name has me thinking maybe he wasn't a great person, but
Interesting. Okay. All right. We'll talk about some of the decisions that came out of his court, but I'm going to give you a hint. They include some major advances in civil and voting rights. So just with that information alone, can you guess what political party Warren belonged to?
My guess I think I'd also have an like time frame. Skipping ahead, my guess he was a Democrat. Just hearing that.
He was a member of the Republican Party.
Hmm.
And I wanted to point that out because to cue our listeners in who are either new to the United States or who just keep politics at arm's length, and I don't blame you if that is your stance. Warren is just one example of how partisan extremes have shifted. And I won't go on too much of a tangent, but the way that conservatism and liberalism looked even just a few decades ago is so wildly different. It blows my mind. So I just needed to kind of drive that point home. And Martin, give us your thoughts before I ask you to read some text.
Yeah, I think there are like two major shifts in political ideology between the two major parties that have gone back in America's history. And I think one was near the Civil War, and then one it was around the time that we've been talking about in the podcast so far is kind of around that civil rights era. And it feels like there was some shifts in what the parties believed in. And there's some interesting details as to like why.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is probably well covered in mini books and in podcasts. But I think it's worth listeners, if you're not familiar, if this is sounding new to you, do your own research, because the idea that parties stand for certain things. I mean, we only have two, so how much could they really capture the thoughts, wants, needs, desires of the average you and I, right? So I just recommend that folks be thinking about that, because neither one is perfect and they've changed.
Not to heap too much praise on Washington, but since we talked about him earlier and kind of the foundations of the country, Washington, I think, famously declared or advised against turning into a two-party system. He found that troublesome. You can probably pick a dozen reasons out of a hat as to why that is, but it's interesting. That's what we became.
Definitely fodder for more discussion, for sure. Martin, can you read this language from history.com for our listeners? And this is about Chief Justice Earl Warren.
The former Republican politician and California's only three-term governor was appointed to the court by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953. At the time, the president noted Warren represented, quote, the kind of political, economic, and social thinking that I believe we need on the Supreme Court, end quote. However, following Warren's landmark rulings on cases such as the landmark Brown v. Board of Education that banned school segregation, Eisenhower would come to call the appointment, quote, the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made.
That was a lot in there. Martin, what do you make of this?
Yeah, there's a whole lot there. It's wild to me that someone, and obviously we have the foresight of, or the hindsight, the benefit of hindsight here. But to call Brown the Board of Education, quote, the biggest damned fool mistake I ever made, that's pretty wild. I don't even know where to go with that. Like,
yeah, I mean, you're pointing out the sort of political nature that surrounds court appointments, right? Mm-hmm. And the nomination process, appointment process is loaded with, what do I think this person's going to do for me and how will they advance my agenda? And that's even for this body, this judicial body that's supposed to be, counter-majoritarian and insulated from the waves of political shift. Mm-hmm. But Eisenhower went in expecting that there would not be the sort of civil rights landmark cases that were the signatures of the Warren Court. And I just think that's wild, that a president would be disappointed that we are at a place where we don't have schools segregated anymore. But that's what happened.
Yeah, definitely gives me some more thoughts on Eisenhower, because from what I understand, great general, kind of a weak president, and really made some misjudgments and some bad decisions, I think, as president. But it's interesting that even a military man like Eisenhower, right, like who's supposed to be above reproach, like he's above reproach, like he is a legendary general. You would guess that person would be all about brass tacks, right? They would be all about doing things practically, doing things quote unquote the right way. And yet here he is essentially commenting that he kind of expected quid pro quo for nominating him to be Chief Justice. It's wild. Also interesting to the point we were talking about earlier. Because the Chief Justice Earl Warren was a Republican politician and a California governor for 3 terms, and in fact, the only one it seems like at the time. So, talking about how political climate has changed.
Yes, and definitely recommend that listeners do more research on Chief Justice Earl Warren. Fascinating individual. And to your point, how you describe Eisenhower, well, how you describe him as the brass tacks and above reproach, I imagine he would probably think of himself as exactly that, and that his actions were in full consistency with those characteristics. Also, to your point of, maybe weak president and maybe made choices that were less than stellar, probably could be said of any president. It's not just a hard job, but these people are so far from perfect, as we all are. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's fair.
Martin, I have a fun fact for you that I learned in law school, and that's also described on the history.com page that you read quoted language for us. So Warren was appointed to the court to fill a vacancy that was left by a justice who had a heart attack. He joined the court in 1954. And something else happened in 1954. Can you guess what that was?
Is that the Korean War?
More related to Supreme Court stuff.
Oh.
More related to a decision that we just read that Eisenhower was critical of.
Is that Brown v. Board?
So, yes. In fact, Thurgood Marshall got a chance to re-argue Brown versus Board because he argued it for the justice that had left. And the court was very divided under that justice. But then when Warren came in, because again, he came in to fill the vacancy from the person who left by the person who had the heart attack, they got a chance to redo the arguments. And the decision was unanimous. Brown versus Board was unanimous after Warren joined the court. Thoughts on this factoid?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's hard to not now think of Chief Justice Warren as enabling that to happen, and kind of giving Thurgood maybe a mulligan. Who knows if he would have needed it, I guess, right? Because they didn't vote after the first argument, or did they?
From what I've read, the court was just divided, but I don't know that they had already started to put pen to paper on the decision. I'm not sure. That information may be out there. I just don't know.
Don't have a handle, yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there wasn't like a decision made. And if that's the case, it seems like Warren was instrumental in giving Thurgood Marshall a chance to argue again and resulting in a unanimous decision when they were where there was disagreement before. It also, reading between lines, you have to assume Warren was, whipping his fellow judges or justices into like understanding the legal concepts or, whatever, presenting some sort of compelling argument, whatever, however he did it, to get everyone to buy in and to kind of view things the same way, which is incredible. Just super impressive. I think it's also interesting, if we circle back, I'm just going to be crapping on Eisenhower some more, but he called the appointment the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made in direct response to Brown v. Board of Education, which was a unanimous decision. Sounds like it wasn't just Warren, buddy, but also it was a unanimous decision. Like, get 9 people to agree on anything.
Very well said. I'm giving you applause here. I will say though, to take a position that's not counter per se, but it de-emphasizes Warren's intentional actions, which is the timing aspect of it all. But for the person's heart attack, he would not have been in the role, right? And so he would not have been in the position to. So it's less that he enabled Marshall's arguments to be successful, but it was more just coming in, like the sort of chance and like circumstance that it just so happened that he joined the court at a time that was so critical for Brown versus Board. And I just want to point that out. Like, things could change at the stroke of a hat, right? Like, vacancies could happen on a predictable cadence. Justice Breyer retired, right? Or someone gets sick, someone passes away, and then that leaves room for somebody who could drastically change the direction of the court.
Talking about recurring themes. Wonder as we get through the history of the Supreme Court, I wonder if we might get some more of that.
That theme will recur. Martin, can you describe this image on the Warren Court page for our listeners?
Yes. Okay. There's a lovely red, looks like felt kind of curtain as a backdrop. They are, I guess, 5 of them are seated. I'm guessing that's Warren in the middle with the glasses.
Yes.
But they're all a bunch of old white men. One whose hair is not gray and is dark. A couple bespectacled in their robes, kind of looking solemnly at the camera.
Very solemn. Very solemn. But I mean, these are the guys that are responsible for Brown versus Board and a number of other critical civil rights, individual rights cases. So we have been able to get to various states of social progress. And often it's been old white men that have been charged, but we've still made various progress. And I just think it's interesting to see this because today's court looks very different. And then you also kind of see the conservative and liberal lines, save for an exception, but you kind of see them fall within like the diversity on the court, right? The women, the people of color. Again, important. There's an exception in there. But I mean, the Warren Court, from superficial appearances, not diverse at all, and yet we still had these monumental civil rights cases as a result come from their court.
Yeah, I honestly, my first initial reaction was kind of like, this is kind of what I would expect a Supreme Court to look, a bunch of old guys who look kind of judgely, I guess. One of them with a bow tie. I forgot to mention that actually earlier. So I bet you he's the fun justice. But I think that also like it kind of gets meta here in that appearance wise, these guys kind of look like what you would imagine a Supreme Court would look like in the United States. But based on the decisions, they kind of made some decisions as you would expect a Supreme Court to operate, in that they were not making these political decisions. I can imagine, and this is me judging solely on appearances and given the time it was in this country, I can imagine many of these guys probably were against school integration. If you would have asked them what they thought was, maybe morally or ethically or what politically they sponsored, I would bet a lot of money that at least a couple of these guys would have been against it. And yet they took the role seriously. They listened to Thurgood Marshall's arguments and were able to strip away some of their personal beliefs. There's a whole lot of assumptions by me, but I'm assuming that they were able to strip away some of their personal beliefs and neutral judges, which is what we would hope for all judges, particularly the ones of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Excellent points. Excellent points. It wasn't just Brown versus Board that was decided during the Warren Court era. There were so many more important cases that included protection for dependents of members of the armed forces, access to justice for poor folks, voter protection cases, and of course, the case that's very near and dear to the hearts of Martin and to me, Loving versus Virginia. So some huge, huge cases were decided in that 1953 to 1969 time period. And with everything that you said, Martin, I think that definitely underscores the points. The backgrounds that these guys had on the court would not necessarily lead to them, individually coming to certain conclusions. But when evaluating the evidence and when taking so we hope and could imagine, neutral approach, weighing the arguments, they found in favor of often marginalized communities.
So despite my original guess that Warren was a standard bearer of the court, he was actually, sounds like quite the opposite, in that he was like one of the few shining rays of light, or oversaw a period with that light.
Right.
So I mean, among the many amazing things to come out of the Warren Court, like, for example, legal protection for you and I as people of different racial backgrounds, of the son of people of different racial backgrounds being able to marry. That's something that affects our lives daily, or I guess thankfully it doesn't affect our lives. Like, thankfully we're able to be together without it being a criminal act.
Martin, we're definitely going to need an episode on Loving versus Virginia on its own. There's just so much that can be said about it, and that I think we would find important to speak about. For listeners that aren't familiar with that Supreme Court case, it is the 1967 Supreme Court case in which the Warren Court decided that laws banning interracial marriage are unconstitutional. So yes, Martin, I agree with you. So many cases came out of the Warren Court that improved the quality of life for working class folks, people of color, people who their descendants are folks like us, right, who benefit from these cases. The country certainly wasn't like rainbows and unicorns in 1969, but individual rights and freedoms were definitely a high priority for the court.
And so it continued that way, and it only got better, right?
So I think we should end today's episode on a high note. In the next episode, we will conclude our Supreme Court history discussion, and we'll be talking about the court and the Chief Justice that laid the foundation for today's court, the modern court. Martin, you might want to bring a stress ball to squeeze or something, or like make sure Maribel's close so that you can give her hugs during that episode.
Oh, I can't wait. Yeah, I was going to say, luckily we have our podcast pup with us most of the time. So yeah, I'll do my best. And listeners also prepare accordingly. Thank you so much for tuning in to the first two parts of the Supreme Court history. Stick with us for the third and final episode on this topic.
And as you're waiting for part 3 to drop, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and at Lawyer and Layman on Threads, Twitter/X, YouTube, and TikTok. If you like what you hear, please rate our podcast and subscribe. Let us know if there's any topics you'd like us to explain. Don't walk around not knowing.